Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're looking at a game which just came out. The Finals, a free-to-play game and pay to dress up. It came out on December 7 by Embark Studio. This is an online PvP game, cross-platform multiplayer and in-app purchase. The minimum requirement is the Intel i5 6600K or the AMD Ryzen 5 1600. Oddly 12 gig of RAM, GTX 1050 Ti or AMD Radeon RX 580. Welcome to Response PC. I'm Dunk. Let's game on. So for this proposed minimum requirement, I'm going to use the Ryzen 5 1600 because I don't have the i5 6600K. Then 12 GB of RAM. Oddly enough, it will be 3 times 4 GB. I hope my CPU don't hate me for that. Then for the GPU, it's quite weird. They put the GTX 1050 Ti versus RX 580. The RX 580 is way better than the 1050, like by a good margin. But I have the GTX 960, which is comparable to the 1050 Ti. A little bit lower on some game, a little bit better on others. It's also a 4 GB card, so we're going to use the GTX 960. So this is an FPS game. So we're going to look at the 60 FPS to be able to play adequately. It also needs to be smooth. The proposed minimum requirement didn't say it was 720p or 1080p or 1440p, but my guess was 1080p. FPS at 720p is not the best looking. We're going to try everything at low. FSR is available, so we're going to use FSR quality. And on my first play of the game, with those settings, we reach an average of 59 FPS. That is exactly what we're looking for. I guess their proposed minimum requirement is exactly what it's going to be as the real minimum requirement. They somehow nail their real minimum requirement with that proposed minimum requirement. They ask for 12 GB of RAM. We're using peak 9.6. The GPU is pegged at 99%, so this is really nice. And the CPU has a little bit of headroom, peaking at 65% of utilization. So the proposed minimum requirement is really nailed to the real minimum requirement. A little bit of headroom for the CPU, but still playing at 60 FPS at 1080p. I still feel the RX 580 is a bit exaggerated for the proposed minimum requirement, because if you look something comparable to the 1050 Ti would be the R9 380, which we're going to try right now. Yes, it's 1 year older than the 1050 Ti, and the 1050 Ti is still driver supported by Nvidia, but it feels like a closer match to the 1050 Ti. So with outdated driver for the R9 380, which date from June 2022, that GPU can fare quite well in the finals. At 1080p low FSR quality, field of view 100, we get an average of 54 FPS, but is less smooth than the GTX 960. We get a high of 75, but we also get low of 30s. But if you play a bit with the settings, or just even move FSR to balance, you reach 60 FPS constantly. Still have some drop and highs, make it a bit less smooth than the GTX variant. And now, the closest thing I have from a RX 580 is my GTX 1060 6GB. They are 1 year apart, but in terms of performance, they are about the same. Yes, the RX 580 have 8GB, but still perform the same. I will redo the test when I get my hand on the RX 580, but for now, let's do the GTX 1060 6GB. At 1080p, low FSR quality, field of view 100, we reach an average of 78 FPS, but the GPU is not pegged, and we're using a max of 3.3 VRAM of the 6GB. You definitely can crank up a bit the visual quality. We're just over half of the memory the card have, and the GPU is at 89% of usage. To finish, I'm going to try the GTX 980 Ti, another old card from 2015, older than the 1060 6GB, but way more powerful. If we keep the setting everything that what should be the minimum requirement at 1080p to get 60 FPS, we get 84 FPS with the GTX 980 Ti. But that is not a card to play at 1080p low settings. But even though we reach 84 FPS, the usage is in the 70s and the memory of the card is barely reaching 3GB of the 6. So if you have a GTX 980 Ti, dose yourself and crank up the settings. Don't mind my gameplay. The 4 match I've played was testing those cards, but I'm going to test more cards in the future and try to figure out which is the real CPU for the minimum requirement. But for now, you can trust the proposed minimum requirement from Embark Studio beside the RX 580 for some reason. Other than that, that's all for that video, and see you on the next one. And subscribe.
at the door of Vault 2 from the Mighty.